Welcome to the Eastside Freedom Library. I'm Peter Ratcliffe, the co-executive director. We're based in an historic Carnegie Library building, which is located on what was Dakota land here on St. Paul's East Side. Our mission is to inspire solidarity, work for justice, and advocate for equity for all. To this aim, we collect resources, now more than 22,000 books, visual art, music, films, and the richness of the wonderful Hmong archives. And we curate programs which help to bring into the center of our awareness the experiences and stories of people who have been on the margins of our society and our history. We see art, storytelling, visual art, music, theater, poetry, dance, literature as powerful vehicles through which our neighbors can share their stories with each other. Since the onset of the pandemic, we have turned to virtual programming as a way to keep sharing these stories and encourage the conversations that need to take place. Maps are essential to how historical narratives are told. Traditional cartographic conversations either erase the territorial holdings of indigenous nations or superimpose the boundaries of modern American states over the historical maps, making the presence of the United States seem like an inevitability. This series of 8 anti-colonial maps that you are about to see seek to complicate our discussion around the history of the illegal seizure of indigenous lands and make the timescale of indigenous land loss easier to conceptualize. Jennings Mergenthal, Macalester College class of 21, created this series of maps, which range from 1776 through 2019, illustrating where the Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Ho-Chunk peoples lived and when they lived there. The maps visually depict how indigenous peoples were forced to cede millions of acres of land, leading to the forced displacement of their communities. Jennings Maps are works of art, which are also intended to encourage a way of looking at history, of recognizing the connections between the past and the present, revealing, as they put it, quote, an ongoing arc of the present that is a continuation of the same beliefs, policies, and legacies, unquote, established in the past. Jennings created these maps for Macalester's International Roundtable last fall, and the Eastside Freedom Library was excited to host an exhibit of them this past winter. We see these maps not only as a new way to tell the stories of the experiences of indigenous people, but also to think about how we all become used to hearing and seeing stories in particular ways. We think that Jennings Maps can disrupt our familiar ways of seeing and thinking. We were also hopeful about using this exhibit to encourage conversations among members of many communities who have themselves experienced expropriation, dislocation, relocation, and then the misrepresentation of their story. Unfortunately, the exhibit was cut short by the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we're delighted that Jennings is willing to videotape their presentation of the maps and that they are generously leaving a set of the maps with us at ESFL for us to preserve and use in other projects. Thank you, Jennings. Please enjoy their presentation. Thank you.
Welcome to An Aggressive, Unprovoked, and Most Savage War, a series of 8 maps depicting the loss and capture of indigenous lands in what is now the state of Minnesota by the settler colonial United States government. I'm Jennings, I made the maps, and I'm going to walk you through each of them and their histories. This is by no means a complete history, this is just a history. There are a lot of bad maps out there, especially when it comes to Indigenous nations. If Indigenous people are included at all, we're generally shown on maps as having no territorial boundaries, just existing on the land, not actually occupying it in any meaningful way. And I wanted to push back on all these bad maps with some maps of my own. The 8 maps I've made have no modern-day political boundaries. While political boundaries can be useful to help people orient themselves today, it also makes these borders seem like they are inevitable. The colonial borders of the United States are not inevitable and never were. Also, the idea that north is up is completely arbitrary, and many cultures use different orientations for up. The Anishinaabe migrated westward from the Atlantic Ocean, so the traditional Anishinaabe orientation is to use east as up. The Dakota orient using south as up. The labels on these maps are meant to appear right side up when viewed from the orientation of the culture. These maps show the history of the cession and capture of Indigenous lands in what is now Minnesota. But Indigenous history itself did not begin when Americans arrived. Maps tell stories, and this is not the story of inevitable American settlement. This is the story of Indigenous resilience in the face of genocide and displacement. In the Dakota tradition, the center of creation and the origin of life is at Bdote, the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, near what is labeled Kaposia on my map. The Anishinaabe began their eastward migration in the 1500s. By the 1600s, they had arrived on the edges of Dakota land and entered a mutually beneficial political alliance, which lasted nearly 60 years. During this time, both nations benefited from shared trade and kinship networks. In 1736, war broke out and a series of military campaigns would continue into 1770, when an Anishinaabe victory would establish their permanent and exclusive control over the northern regions. After 1770, conflicts between the Anishinaabe and Dakota cooled, and borders settled, but tensions would remain until the mid-1800s. In 1805, American First Lieutenant Zebulon Pike led a military expedition and authored a treaty with Dakota leaders near Bdote. Despite having no legal authority to make treaties, Pike purchased the lands for nearly $10,000, which was never delivered. However, only 2 of 5 Dakota leaders present signed. In 1820, the United States founded Fort St. Anthony on the lands fraudulently purchased 15 years earlier by Pike. Upon completion of the fort in 1825, its name was changed to Fort Snelling. The Half-Breed Tract was established in 1830, and was land designated to benefit the mixed-race Dakota and white children of traders and trappers, many of whom were married into Dakota families. In the 1830 Treaty of Prairie du Chien, the United States negotiated the purchase of a strip of territory between the Dakota in the north and the Sac-and-Meskwaki to the south. Superintendent of Indian Affairs William Clark told the delegation in no uncertain terms that the purchase of the strip was intended to stop conflicts between the 2 indigenous nations, and that if a peace deal was not brokered, they would face the United States Army. In 1832, the Ho-Chunk were made to sell their lands east of the Mississippi River to the United States in return for $10,000 annually for 27 years, money that was never delivered in total. The Ho-Chunk were also made to move under the strip of neutral territory purchased by the United States in 1830. The Half-Breed Tract remained largely unoccupied until 1850. Despite not being part of the Dakota lands sold to the United States in 1850, many white settlers illegally staked claims within the tract. In 1854, Henry Rice, the delegate to Congress from the Minnesota Territory, convinced the Senate to acquire the rights to the tract. As part of these terms, the mixed-race occupants of the tract could receive up to 640 acres of land by forfeiting their claims within the tract. Those that sold their land would receive exchanging scrip, a paper credit that could be used to buy federal lands anywhere in the United States. Although the sale of scrip was technically illegal, significant portions were often purchased by white land speculators who coerced mixed-race occupants into forfeiting or selling their scrip. Despite the original intent to preserve the land rights of mixed Dakota, the Half-Breed Tract ended up primarily benefiting white settlers. In 1837, a Ho-Chunk delegation that traveled to Washington to lobby for the return of the lands promised to them in 1832. In 1837, a Ho-Chunk delegation traveled to Washington to lobby the returns of the lands promised to them in 1832. Instead, the delegation was told that they were not allowed to return to their nation unless they agreed to the terms of a new treaty. The new treaty reduced the size of the neutral territory and forced the Ho-Chunk to move into the Long Prairie Reservation in Minnesota Territory. Many Ho-Chunk opted to illegally return to Wisconsin rather than move again to territory promised by the United States. The new reservation was heavily wooded and not suited to the traditional agrarian Ho-Chunk lifestyle. Furthermore, Ho-Chunk leaders complained that the territory had been forced upon them instead of chosen with their consent, which was, in fact, entirely true. The other portion of Anishinaabe territory purchased in 1847 was initially planned as a reservation for the Menominee Nation, also being moved from Wisconsin. However, the Menominee staunchly refused to sign any treaty moving them to Minnesota territory, instead remaining on their ancestrally held lands. In 1849, the Minnesota Territorial Assembly desired the removal of Anishinaabe from the southern shore of Gitchigumi, Lake Superior. Their proposal, removing all Anishinaabe from their lands in Michigan and Wisconsin, was submitted to the Senate and signed by President Zachary Taylor in February of 1850. The Ojibwe protested, citing that under the 1842 Treaty of La Pointe, they were guaranteed the right to remain on their land. Governor Alexander Ramsey planned to force the Ojibwe to leave. Ramsey instructed John Watrous, the agent in charge of treaty annuity payments, to tell the Ojibwe they would not receive payment unless they traveled to Sandy Lake in the Minnesota Territory. Once the Ojibwe arrived, Ramsey planned to delay the payments until the winter when the rivers were frozen, preventing the Ojibwe from returning to Gitchigumi. The Ojibwe were instructed by Watrous to expect payment at Sandy Lake on October 25th of 1850. As Ramsey planned, the payment did not arrive until nearly a month later. Several thousand Anishinaabe had gathered at the initial date, and Watrous found many starving from spoiled and insufficient government rations. Watrous did not pay the annuities in cash, again in violation of the Treaty of La Pointe. Instead, annuities were distributed in the form of provisions from subcontracted traders, who charged exorbitant prices for food and trade goods. Payments were finally completed by December 3rd, and by a week later more than 150 Ojibwe had died. The Ojibwe departed on December 10th. By this time, again as Ramsey had planned, the rivers were frozen and the Ojibwe were forced to walk back to their lands instead of canoeing. Leaders estimate that more than 230 died on the march back. Despite clear violation of federal law, neither Ramsey nor Watrous were disciplined. Their policies of forced removal continued in this template until 1853. The Lake Superior Ojibwe continued to resist removal until 1854, when they were able to sign a new treaty guaranteeing permanent reservations and on-site annuity payments. As early as 1849, Ho-Chunk leaders officially filed complaints insisting that they be moved to more suitable lands. In 1853, their protest proved successful. The draft of the Watab Treaty proposed an exchange of the Long Prairie Reservation for 500,000 acres to the south along the Crow River about 40 miles from St. Paul. This treaty faced heavy opposition from white Minnesotans, and they insisted that the treaty be revised so heavily that the Ho-Chunk leaders rejected it outright. In February of 1855, a new treaty was ratified, dissolving the Long Prairie Reservation that the Ho-Chunk had been previously assigned, and moving them to Blue Earth County in the southern part of Minnesota Territory. The new land was among the most fertile in the Minnesota Territory, and the Ho-Chunk found it well suited to their agricultural needs. This effectively meant that white settlers were being displaced to make way for an indigenous reservation, which made them very angry. By May of that year, the Ho-Chunk Nation began their move southward to Blue Earth. They were greeted by protests in nearby Mankato. White colonists were furious that they had been forced to move to accommodate Indians. In 1858, Minnesota became the 32nd state in the Union, and a group of 6 Dakota leaders were called to Washington, D.C. for land negotiations. The delegation was not allowed to return home until they ceded their rights to land north of Wakpa, Minnesota, the Minnesota River, nearly half of the territory guaranteed to them under the 1851 treaty. In 1862, Indian agent George Day reported to President Lincoln that he'd uncovered numerous violations of the law and many frauds committed by past Indian agents against the Dakota. Day's pleas were left unheeded. The 1863 Dakota Uprising was the product of years of increasing tensions between the Dakota and white Minnesotans, and is the subject of many far longer, far better written, and far more complete books. The United States Civil War began in 1861. Consequently, the payment of treaty annuities to indigenous nations was no longer a priority to the federal government. Annuity money consistently arrived late. Lack of available hunting grounds on the Dakota Reservation, in combination with a poor harvest in 1861, meant that the Dakota had little food stored. Instead, they were forced to rely on goods from white traders. When the government money did not arrive, traders refused to extend credit to the Dakota, and by 1863 the situation had grown dire. Some Dakota took to wandering off-reservation in search of food. On August 17th, 4 Dakota boys killed 5 white settlers while stealing eggs to eat. This sparked the 6-week period known as the Dakota Uprising, or the U.S.-Dakota War. More than 3,000 Dakota non-combatants were held in an internment camp outside of Fort Snelling during the brutal winter of 1863. More than 300 died there from disease and exposure. Other prisoners of war were held at Camp McClellan in Davenport, Iowa. 392 Dakota warriors were tried. They were offered no defense counsel, and many of the men could neither speak nor read English. Trials lasted an average of 15 minutes, and 303 were sentenced to death. President Abraham Lincoln reviewed the cases and commuted the sentence of all but 39, one of whom died before the 38 Dakota men were hung outside Mankato on December 26, 1862. It was the largest mass hanging in United States history. In 1863, the nearly 2,000 Ho-Chunk in Minnesota were forcibly removed to the Dakota Territory. 550 died on the journey to Crow Creek, South Dakota, and those that survived found barren and arid soil, nothing like the fertile farmlands they had left in Minnesota. Their white neighbors celebrated their departure by waving flags and firing cannons. Despite having no part in the uprising of 1862, many white Minnesotans inherently distrusted the Ho-Chunk. Many prominent businessmen and political leaders vocally supported Ho-Chunk removal. The anti-Ho-Chunk sentiment coalesced into the creation of the Knights of the Forest, a secret society with the sole purpose of removing or exterminating all Indigenous people from the state of Minnesota. The society lasted until the late 1800s. Several Anishinaabe leaders voiced support for the Dakota Uprising, but there was never a fully coherent movement among the Ojibwe, or even the Dakota for that matter. The Anishinaabe signed 2 treaties with the United States government, one in 1863 and another in 1866. These established reservations in northern Minnesota. Some Ojibwe resisted the move to the reservations, but were eventually forced into relocation. The reservations were intended to be communally held only until the Ojibwe were able to become sufficiently civilized in the view of the United States. At that point, each resident would be allotted a certain acreage, and remaining lands would become the property of the United States government, who would sell off their newly acquired lands to white settlers. This would later become a template for dealing with indigenous nations the country over. Holland the Younger, an Ojibwe chief and the self-styled leader of all Ojibwe, planned to fight the removal to reservations. However, while on his way to Washington, D.C. in 1868, he was assassinated by a group financed by mixed-blood Ojibwe traders who felt he threatened their livelihoods. It has been more than 200 years since Pike's Treaty was signed. There have been constant active efforts to delegitimize, destroy, and undermine Indigenous peoples and nations. And yet, the story of Indigenous peoples in this place is a story of survivance, not decimation. This was, and still is, Indigenous land. Indigenous nations will continue to adapt and survive, as we have always done.
Thank you for visiting our video. I'm Beth Cleary.
I'm Peter Ratcliffe, and this is Orso, the library dog.
We are the co-founders and co-executive directors of the Eastside Freedom Library in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Our mission is to inspire solidarity, work for justice, and advocate for equity for all. If you enjoy our programming and want to support our work, please visit our website, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org.